This next session that we've got coming up, this is information design for advocacy. And we've brought in University of Washington Associate Professor Karen Cheng, who has taught information design and data visualization at the University of Washington since 2002. She's also worked in brand management for Procter & Gamble, studied engineering at Penn State University, and is a published author, including her book, Designing Type, where she discusses issues of structure, optical compensation, and legibility. Today, she's going to share with us how data can be used for advocacy work and how design visualization can help make your message both clear and engaging. Please welcome Associate Professor Karen Cheng.
Hello. Sorry, I have to adjust this a little bit. Thanks so much for coming to this session. I know you have a choice of sessions. I'm pleased that you've chosen to fly with us. So I'm delighted to talk to you today about information design, which is one of my areas of special research interest at UW. I've been teaching information design or data visualization at UW for about 10 or 12 years now. So I thought this may not be necessary for the participants in this conference, and especially those of you who have chosen to come to this session, but I thought it was still worthwhile to begin with maybe the obvious question, why information design? Or maybe why is information design valuable? So, essentially, information design adds seeing to reading to make complex information easier to understand. And so the magic of data visualization is, of course, that you can visually express relationships to communicate ideas. There's substantial research from cognitive psychology that proves that people learn and remember more when you combine pictures and words together, as opposed to if you just have words. So in this definition, information design is essentially using images, symbols, colors, and text to make your messages clear, compelling, and convincing. So you can see why that would be important for advocacy work. So it's not necessarily, I think, a complex thing. I mean, I think there are obviously more complex data visualizations and less complex ones, and I'll try to show you a variety in this talk today. But some of you might be familiar with this example that Edward Tufte, who's a big data visualization person, talks about in his first book, where he talks about the John Gotti case. John Gotti was a mafia don in the 80s. He was sometimes referred to as the Teflon Don because he had avoided being indicted on federal charges. And so I think one of the most interesting aspects of this case study in Tufte's book is that when he was acquitted in this case in 1987, there was a piece of evidence that the jury requested for re-examination. And so it's not particularly well designed, like I would never use this typeface actually, but it actually is quite clear. If you look across the top here, you'll see these are the names of the 7 criminals turned government informants. And then if you look along the left-hand side, you'll see the crimes that they had been convicted of. So, you can see quite clearly that none of these people are, real innocent types, and that actually in some cases, for example, armed robbery, almost everybody except for this fellow has participated in it. And then even though some people have participated in less crimes, some of them are pretty significant. And so you're actually doing, using information design right now, what you discover you try to do when you look at charts like this is you first get an overall sense of the pattern, and then you begin mapping to specific values. So in this case, Tufte believes that the jury, having requested this table twice, really was able to use this information design piece to make a decision about the quality of the informants that they were supposed to believe. So, in a different example, some of you may have seen this during the Middle East crisis between Israel and Lebanon, where this appeared in the Belfast Telegraph in 2006. Oops, sorry about that. This thing's a little touchy. So you can see these are all the countries that supported a ceasefire in the Middle East. And then these are the countries that did not. And so it also allows you to evaluate and examine the 3 countries, Israel, the United States, and the UK, who did not support the ceasefire. So those are 2 very simple examples of information design, but they very much dramatize like a persuasive concept. Those were very simple. You could also think about using a series of information graphics in a kind of module. This is a series of infographics that appeared in the magazine called Good Magazine that often does issues of advocacy and information design. And so I'll just zoom in. So this one deals with water. So if all the world's water was put in a pail, only a spoonful of it would be drinkable. But I think, some of the most impactful thing is if you're an American here, this is how much water that you actually use every day, almost 106 gallons. In contrast to this dotted line that you can see, this is the European use of water here, far less, 53 gallons. And in third world countries, developing countries, they only use 1.3 gallons a day. So this allows you to actually see the quantities, show those visual relationships. It's even more shocking if you consider that in those third world developing countries, that's their daily use, right? 1.3 gallons. And actually a low flush toilet uses more than that, 1.6 gallons. So you can see that, we're pretty much incredibly wasteful of water in this particular country. But one of the things I like most about teaching the information graphics class that I teach at UW is that when you translate data into visual formats, you can reveal unexpected patterns or trends. So one of the most obvious, or sort of popular devices now is the Cartesian Plane. So this is just a cartoon, where you might rate fruits on how tasty they were or how untasty they were. And then also some fruits are easy to eat, like grapes, for example, and other fruits are difficult to eat, like pineapples. So you can see they're trying to make these quadrants of if you were a really lazy person, you would only eat easy and tasty fruits. If you were a particularly, complex individual, maybe you'd want to eat difficult and untasty fruits. I'm not sure that I would agree with, for example, I think bananas are, if anything, more tasty than apples, And also I think watermelons are in some ways more difficult than oranges. I thought it was odd that they thought oranges were more. But anyway, you see the idea anyway amongst these, this Cartesian plane. So I thought I'd show you it in application to education because I noticed most of the DRIVE participants are from educational or nonprofit organizations. So a student in this class made this panel here to examine different colleges when I assigned the broad topic of education. So just zooming in, I know it may be a little difficult to see. So along this axis, the y-axis, we have the quality ranking of 20 private schools and 20 public schools. Okay, so this is taken from the US News and World Reports. On the other side here, on the x-axis, you have tuition. So high tuition is here and low tuition is here. The size of the circle then indicates the selectivity of the school. So smaller schools up here these small circles here indicate very selective schools, whereas these larger circles here indicate less selective schools. The private schools are noted here in blue, right? And then the state schools are located here in pink, and then the out-of-state tuition for state schools is located here in green. So you see how it works, right? Because you can see probably by design that tuition of out-of-state schools does not exceed tuition so much of private schools, right? So I'll show you the quadrants in more detail. So if we look to the upper right-hand quadrant, you can see these schools that are highly ranked and very selective are Harvard, Stanford, Duke, Brown, Notre Dame, and so forth, right? And you can see also one of the most expensive out-of-state schools is the University of Michigan, University of Virginia, UC Berkeley, right? So in some ways, this is schools that cost a lot and are supposedly worth it, like high ranking, high price. On the other side then, you might consider these to be bargain schools. Of course, all these schools are pretty good because we're working with the top 20 state schools and the top 20 private schools. But, for example, my own school, University of Washington, very much a bargain in terms of an in-state thing because you can see, the ranking's still pretty good in the upper half of the quality rating, but the tuition's much lower, right? And you also see Penn State, where I did my undergraduate degree, for example. So then we move to the bottom quadrant, and notice how the circles are larger now because the schools are less selective, and they don't cost very much, but they're not as good either. So you can see that's sort of the quadrant. So the probably least desirable quadrant is they cost quite a bit, but they're not ranked as highly either. So in these schools you see, for example, St. Louis or Drexel and so forth. And again, these are all good schools. It's just a way of looking at, sort of where maybe the cost ranking attributes fall off. Okay, so again, to see the, and then you see this overall pattern as well, like sort of small, tight circles in the upper right, and then larger, looser circles in the lower left, right? Okay. So Chris Sorensen, who was one of the organizers of this conference, asked me what I thought of his development activity pyramid. So I imagine many of you in development have a similar idea where you can have quite a lot of donors from who only give $1 to $100, right? Here you can see at UW, there's 7,000 of those donors, right? And then you can see at the next level, increasingly these numbers on this side, you see how we only have 7 donors during this time period, who give up to $5 million. But you can see actually that generates more money than these $7,000, 7,000 donors that you have who give very little money, right? So he was, so here has these sort of 3 areas of the pyramid, this sort of darker gold, lighter gold, and this whiter area. I guess we must not have had any donors in this period who gave $10 million or more. So I think the major issue with that particular pyramid is that it's actually not scaled in any way to indicate the number of donors or the quantity of money. I don't know if you notice on this side then here, it's the quantity of money. So in other words, it just makes this triangle, even though actually there's, less than half the amount of donors here. You see what I'm saying? Like it's not scaled in that way. So here's an attempt that one of our students tried, Daphne Hugh. And you can see here there's donors are on this side. It's a 3-dimensional chart, which has certain issues because we're not very good as humans at perceiving 3-dimensional charts. But you can see here there's 7,000 donors here versus 7 donors here. On this axis here is the total amount of money they contribute. So you can actually see the pyramid does indeed exist. It goes narrower, but you also see that there are sort of little spikes in the money. It's just a different way of maybe trying to look for patterns in that data or trying to get at different things. See, if you turn the model around and look at it from the top, like if I rotate it, you can see actually these 3 groups all have about the same number of donors, 1,200, 1,200, 1,200, if you round them all off. But they actually each increase, because of the quantity of money they give in double amounts. So this block is double this block is double this block, roughly. So it's just a different way to kind of visualize that donor pyramid. It may or may not be successful. A different way to maybe look at it would be also considering perhaps if you just considered the total amount of money that a donor gives. So you might be able to better imagine it by saying, okay, all these people would have to give a certain amount in order to add up to these people. Or you have a huge raft of these people, standing on small platforms to add up to these. You see, it's just a different way to visualize that pyramid. Okay. But I mean, those were probably more complex than they needed to be. It's always very difficult to make a graph in 3 dimensions. This is a simple panel that was made by a student to explore the US veterans system. And even just a simple bar graph can be very informative. So this upper graph shows disability compensation. So these are the 50 states here. And so every time a veteran tries to get disability compensation, they can apply once. And this first green bar shows the rate of acceptance. So you can see even at the highest state, New Hampshire, it's not fully high. So then the second bar here, this lighter green bar, shows reapplication. If you're denied, you can appeal, right? So I showed this chart actually to a doctor who works at the VA, and he said it was rather shocking because you would like to think that throughout the country, Veterans Association is a national organization, that these bars would be flat, but it doesn't really account for the fact in Washington, D.C., and Hawaii, and New Hampshire, the rates are much higher than they are in Tennessee, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Georgia. Similarly, this map shows the actual amount of disability compensation given to veterans. And you can see in these bright green areas here, this is where veterans receive the most money, followed by the lighter green areas, right, and then the lighter gray areas. So the least amount of money is received by veterans who are in this dark gray area. So that's what I mean by showing patterns. Like you may not be able to see this kind of information in tables, but you can see it when it's visualized in actual bars. Psychologists show that we're actually quite good at being able to compare the lengths and sizes of different bars. Okay. This is a different project that I did with a graduate student, Sergei Larinov, where we requested and received from the Seattle police 500,000 parking tickets in data, and so then we were able to analyze them. So I think one of the most interesting, small visualizations is just when do people get parking tickets? So you can see actually you can get a parking ticket at any time of the night. Like it's a 24/7 activity. Usually the ones we found that are in this period are like you parked in a no loading zone, or there are these things called scofflaw tickets. If you leave your keys in the car door, that is a ticket. If your car is leaking oil, you can get a ticket. But they aren't very common. They're fairly rare tickets. But you can see the peak actually occurs over lunchtime. We were trying to hypothesize, why is there this dip at 2 p.m.? Is that when they have their lunch? We weren't sure how that works. So you can see, though, that then there's a sort of second peak right after the kids get out from school, probably. And now, because we have to pay parking until 8 p.m. now due to our mayor, there's a third peak then, much smaller, though. But see how graphing that information tells you, a critical aspect of it. So I thought I'd also talk to you a little bit about the design process, because sometimes when I show the finished graphics to groups, there's kind of a response like, well, how would we do that? So I thought I'd show you the process of one particular project so that you could get a sense of what's entailed. So this is a series of information panels. Again, these are pretty large posters. They're usually about 24 by 16 or so. So some of the type is kind of small to portray in this environment. But it's all about car crashes in America. And you can see 1 in every 100 Americans is seriously injured in a motor vehicle accident every year. So that's 3 million people each year. And of that amount, this many people are involved in a fatality, that it actually causes death. So you can see that amount of people is then put out into these platforms. I'll zoom in for you. So you can see of these fatalities, you can see that some are drivers, some are passengers, some are pedestrians, some are motorcyclists, and some are cyclists. This doesn't show it, but interestingly, 85% of motorcyclists are male, and they have higher rates of driving while intoxicated, actually. So, but you can also look at that pattern again by age. So you can see there's kind of a spike in the 16 to 30 aged group here for fatalities, and again after 75. There's actually like a nice cluster here where it's slightly lower from 61 to 75. So I look forward to moving into that group. I'm actually in this group right now and have had several accidents, actually. I'm not a very good driver. So you can see here then by gender, men still get in more accidents than women. Probably more men drive than women drive. And they're involved in a higher percentage of blood alcohol level greater than 0.8, or driving while intoxicated. So, so that's kind of the final thing. So how did it begin? The student has to begin by looking at just the data and seeing what it says. So you can see here just a simple graph where he discovered that age aspect, and then this is the gender aspect. So you can see these are the fatalities. Males are blue, women are this sort of pink magenta color. So you can see men beat women for fatalities at every age except for less than 15. This must be like a weird kind of accident, like I took your car kind of accident. Yeah. Okay, so then one way that we work with the students, or that students try to work, basically, is like try to ask questions. If you have questions, what can the data tell you? So he wanted to ask the question, who's the better driver, men or women? So he looked over time at men, and he looked over time at women. And that doesn't tell you, I mean, it tells you men have more fatalities, but there's not that much of a trend there. There's a slight lowering here. And then you can look here at the blood alcohol level. There's a much stronger trend in blood alcohol level. See how the women and men have both declined steeply over time, possibly due to legislation. So then here's another idea that he had about showing the quantity of accidents, and we discussed in class, is blood drops the way to go? Like, it's kind of gross, it may be a little too over the top, so even though it illustrates that idea. So then I think what we discussed with those bar charts that I showed you is like, well, it could be really about anything. There's nothing about it that really says it's about driving. This definitely says that it's about death, but I'm not sure it tells you that it's about driving. It's probably more about blood disease or something like that. So you can see then he thought, well, why don't I work with this isotype idea? These little figures were the creation of a Viennese social scientist, Otto Neurath. So you can see here he's come up with this idea, but at this point he's still thinking about these 3 million injured, right? So it may be easier to think about it the way he's figured it out, 1 in every 100. It's easier for us to think of 1 in every 100 than it is to think of 3 million overall. Okay? So then you can see the final idea. So it sometimes takes quite a few iterations, you have to try different ideas and reject them or combine them to come up with the final layout. So this is the second spread of that 3-spread series, and this deals with exactly how crashes happen. And so I think one of the most interesting parts is these fatalities. You can see a lot of fatalities, 40% involve these road departures. Very few, 11%, involve these pedestrians. Intersections are 21%, which is almost the same as lane departures, 18%. So he actually made these by buying little match cars and then photoshopping them together. He had a friend, and that one guy would throw the one, move the other one while he moved this one, and then they had a camera on a tripod and tried to capture that moment. So it was relatively tedious, and you can see in the beginning what he tried is, first of all, he just had like some Matchbox cars. I was like, well, I don't think we should use this Cheerios car. I don't think that, like, it looks like it's not very, doesn't work, And then the other thing, I'm not sure about this sort of cartoony, Shazam kind of thing. I was like, well, this is a pretty serious subject, auto accidents. This makes it seem like it's kind of fun. I'm not sure that's right, So you could see, you have an idea, but every idea has to be refined. This is my favorite of his 3 spreads. It shows the time that accidents occur. So you can see through charting these months, these are the 3 months out of every season, adding up to 12 months, of course. Summer is the peak of accidents. And then the weekend, by far, exceeds the accidents on the weekday. And then you can see through here that if you compare night, morning, afternoon, and evening, evening's the problemo, right? And then on Saturday between 12 and 3, that's the peak of accident times. See, and he actually even scored the deadliest days, and 6 of the 10 of them are on or near holidays, like July 4th and July 3rd are the biggest days. Then you go to around Christmas, and then the remaining days are in August, which is also the deadliest month of the year. So I thought I'd show you how that began. First he came up with that list of the fatalities, and then he also found there was a peak of deaths actually at 6 p.m. around rush hour, I assume. So you can see he's graphed each month, and he's trying to find the, the peaks, and then he's graphed each day of the week, and you can see he's realized that weekends are the key time, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Right? So then you see the second attempt to deal with it. See how he's trying to make the connection, but it's still all flat. Like he's used a red line here to sort of pick out those particular months, then those particular days, and then these particular hours. You see the idea? So it's still not working as well as I think the dimensional idea. So then he adds the dimensional idea, but here it's he's just using a single color, So I think it still works better in his final one. If you recall, I have to sweep through, see how like the color helps you kind of carry from one to the other, probably adds a little bit of visual variety to it as well. Okay, so that's sort of the process. One of the things we do in this class is we rely very heavily on the critique format. So that's a traditional way of learning in art and design, where the students basically, they put their work up, they have to explain what it is they have in mind, and they get responses from myself and from their classmates. So I think that's probably the #1 way we move forward, actually, in the class, is through the series of presentations over 10 weeks. Okay, so I then have some design suggestions or so that perhaps you might be able to incorporate, those of you who make reports or work in information design. Before I talk about those, though, I thought it would be worthwhile to look at an overall suggestion that's made by Edward Tufte, the author of several books on information design. I think this is the best of the 4 books that he has relative to making data graphics, right? So he often talks about what good information design should do is encourage you to think about the substance rather than the form, right? And then encourage you to compare different pieces of data. If you remember back to the John Gotti chart, that's exactly what you begin to do. You want to ask, who's the worst criminal? Is he the darkest? What are the worst crimes? Who have committed those? So in that way, too, you're looking at the data at several levels, from broad to fine. And of course, you want to avoid distortion, although it's difficult to do that. It's sort of, everything you do has some kind of built-in bias to it, really. But in terms of suggestions, then, I have 4 of them from this other book, which I think you might find helpful, called Slidology, if you're looking for sort of tips on designing. And so the Slidology people made the information graphics for Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth, and I thought they worked pretty well. So there's a blog that you can get on, and then you can also see several of videos or like information, even if you don't buy the book. It's a very inexpensive book, though. So the one suggestion they have, which I would think is probably the first place to start, is deciding what's most important to you. So if you have information that's more important, think about how you can make it more important visually. Basically, you can only work with so many variables in the two-dimensional scheme. You can make things bigger, you can change their shape, you can change their color, you can change where they are, or you can do something with the type treatment. See, for example, see how this works? Like, if you have 4 dots, you can very easily identify the one that's different. It's bigger, it's a different shape, it's a different color, it's a different color. You know, here it's a different tint or shade, it's a different color, and it's a different position. They call this in cognitive psychology pop-out effects. They've done studies to show people are extremely good at seeing the different thing. You know, that is a pop-out effect. So in that book, they go on to talk about this has suggestions and implications for the display of data, that all data is often a background, the data itself, and then something you want to emphasize. So you want to say that, you know, General Mills has gone down while Kraft has gone up, but that they've been beaten by Snackwell, you know. So, or similarly here, you know, there's some sort of trend being shown here, and you're emphasizing this particular aspect of it, you know, or that these dots are the outlier in some way. So, you know, it's very powerful using these different things, size, shape, color, you know, and change in position in order to help people see and tell a story from your data. So this is a chart that a student made actually about healthcare. So these are the OECD countries, and so countries that we can be comparable to. And you can see almost immediately your eye does look at this blue one because it's different. I realized earlier today when I was looking through these slides, like it would have made much more sense if he had actually organized them from large to small. Then you could have sort of had a sense of the ranking. And I also realized the countries are not in alphabetical order either. So I need to speak to this student actually at some point. I didn't realize that until I kind of went through it. That would be the sensible thing to do, frankly. Okay. The other thing I would say is that I work with actually scientists. We run I guess like a service at the University of Washington called the Design Help Desk, where we have graduate students available, and you can come in with your data graphic and show them your design and get advice. And actually, one of the biggest things I see there is that people just don't make it simple. Like they think that, well, if I have a lot of things to say, I better say them all. But everything you add to the page competes with everything else. So it's more important to really focus on what are you trying to say with your graphic. So for example, I saw this Tufty suggestion. Those of you who have an iPhone, you know, this is typically the weather that you see. And I feel it actually works quite well. You have a sense of what the weather is doing right now. You have the high and the low predicted for the day, and then you have usually the 7-day forecast. There's even information on it being updated. So I was amazed to see that Tufty has suggested this, where, you know, you get a huge area devoted to what I see as a fairly incomprehensible image, you know, and then also, you know, you have this information is incredibly condensed. You do gain this forecast and so forth, but I think you're really sacrificing a lot rather than relying on this, you know, this simple, effective display. Okay. I think another, you know, pretty famous, you know, failure in the world of information design has been this pyramid, you know, because, you know, they had to revise the pyramid. Like if you look at the old pyramid, I think the problem was, see, I guess they've discovered that white bread and white rice and white pasta and things like that, that's actually not so good for you. And also these fats, oils, and sweets that you used to use sparingly, some fats and oils are actually better for you. You know, so this was now incorrect. And you also see that they wanted to emphasize the idea of exercise. But see, this organization of the pyramid does not take advantage of what the pyramid does. In the original pyramid, see, it's natural for things at the top to be smaller and therefore used less often. So this is a completely senseless idea for a pyramid, you know. So it's not that you couldn't accommodate those ideas in a different pyramid. This is one proposed by a president and fellows of Harvard College, Walter Willett, and you can see how he's placed sensibly at the bottom of the pyramid, this idea of exercise and weight control. Then you get to have whole grain foods here, plant oils, fruits, vegetables, nuts, legumes, fish, poultry, calcium, and now he has the use sparingly red meat and butter, white rice, white bread, white pasta, potatoes, soda, and sweets. And then he has these sort of alcohol moderations, vitamins for most. You know, so what's important about that is to try to keep it simple. Like this doesn't keep it simple for anyone. Plus these things just, you know, spill out from the pyramid without definition. That is not good. Okay, so okay. So those are two suggestions there to keep it simple and focus on your story. Then we could think about the use of color. You know, in a lot of default data visualization software, the default is this kind of color rainbow. But it would be better actually to use color sparingly and to think about grayscale reproduction, because many people print on laser printers. They don't have color laser printers even if they see it on screen. Often, there's research that suggests that we can only really see 5 colors at most to differentiate within a graph, right? So for example, some of you know this, colorblind test. I think it's 8% of males have color blindness of some kind, and it's like 0.5% of women or so. So you can see, even though you can see some differences here, I think it's called a Hashimoto Test. You have this red, but it's the same value, the same gray as the green and the blue. So when you reduce it, you just don't have very much contrast. Like here, you can't see at all the 12, inside here. So probably some of you, if you have color blindness, you can't see, those actual reproductions either. Yeah. And then I think color also has connotations. Most often that green means go, and red means warning. So you can see in this obesity map, at this time, Colorado was one of the leanest states here, and that Mississippi was one of the most obese states. So it makes sense then to have this kind of spectrum. Like it wouldn't make that much sense if we made Mississippi green, for example, and Colorado red. Color has associations and contexts, and that varies by culture as well. But the most fun thing, probably, and the most sensible thing is to show comparisons, contrasts, and differences. What you really want to look for is visible variations. You want to help people see the differences in your data. Like, I think this is a wonderful illustration of the solar system. I was reading the other day that, the Jupiter is 20 times the size of the Earth, but it's so much more powerful to see that. I've also read an interesting article saying that when men walked on the moon, how many people would have liked to see it as opposed to hear about it on the radio, as opposed to read about it the next day. That human beings are kind of wired for this visual preference. So I also saw this recently in the New York Times Magazine about how much sugar we consume. So in one day, 12 teaspoons, about the amount in trowel. In a week, almost 2 cups. Right, in a month, a flower pot. In a year, a wheelbarrow. And in your lifetime, a dumpster's worth of sugar. It's interesting to think about and visualize in these dramatic quantities. Okay. So Chris Sorensen asked me, to take a look a little bit at the typical reports that they produce. This is their ROC, or Reports of Contributions. And I guess I thought the difficult thing about looking at a table like this is once it gets beyond 3 to 5 entries, it's challenging to know who's really that much bigger than someone else. It's not a big deal, but when you look through here, you can begin to see, okay, UW Medicine, that's 12,000 here, that's pretty big. And you begin to scan and be like, okay, these are 3,000, these are 33,000, million, or so. So you can see, that's the activity, but it's not very much encouraged by looking at a table of numbers. So even making this simple chart, this is, again, one of our senior students, Daphne Hugh, did this. You can see how much huger UW Medicine is. Like everybody else, I mean, some people are clearly doing better than others. My own unit is here, unfortunately. But you can see that, UW Medicine is really making it. And so there are 2 colors. One darker color here indicates gifts, and this indicates grants. So you can also really see quite quickly that a lot of it is grant money. So, so see the top is UW Medicine, athletics, libraries, Bothell, engineering, environment, public health, and my home unit, arts and sciences. So if you just take away the gifts, though, and you just look at grants, you can see it's all grants. Like, see how UW Medicine has really quite a substantial number of grants, right? And so if you just look at the gifts then, you can see athletics leads, but they're almost matched by the library. I was, probably you in development know this better, but I was surprised that the library did so well. Okay. So here are closer. So athletics, the library, Bothell, medicine, engineering. See, arts and sciences moves up a bit in that scenario. And then pharmacy, so on. Okay. I also thought I'd show you a visualization that I did for an architecture firm that's about impervious surfaces. This is an environmental issue. When you have an impervious surface like concrete, what happens is all the oils and chemicals that come from your car or bus, they get washed into the water system. They don't absorb into the ground. It also creates wastewater scenarios, where you have these high flooding because water is, not being penetrated into the surface. So this firm actually contacted me because they had been using this table at their meetings, and they told me that they were not getting much understanding or response. So they wanted to build something on Mercer Island. So it shows the total area of Mercer Island, the public facilities there. See, they have a law that you can only have 60% or 40% of the surface in a public area can be impervious surface. So that's concrete or roofing, sidewalks, and so forth. So they have all these calculations and so forth. So in the end, we made several variations, and this is the result. So you can see Mercer Island is, 4,000 acres or so. And of that, public facilities, schools, hospitals, fire stations, museums, so forth, libraries, they're, about 5% of that. So if you blow that out, their current rule is that you can have 40% impervious surface. However, they actually have more than that because some things were built before the law of 40% passed, and so they're actually, slightly over the 40%. So what they've asked for is they wanted to increase it to 60%, right? So that's 25 more acres here. It's still pretty significant because even small amounts of impervious surface make a difference in terms of the environment. But it's just so much more clear to see that visualization, than to see this table, because it illustrates the numbers directly. Okay. So the last suggestion that I have for you, and then I have a concluding example, is the idea of storytelling. There's a lot of psychology studies now that show that people remember information in the form of stories longer and more easily than when you give them information in lists to memorize. So maybe because stories are a kind of primal form of communication that we began by sitting around the campfire and talking about our day hunting the Tatanka. So I think this is a really fascinating example by Nigel Holmes that describes something that's very complex, the US budget. So you can see in this image of Uncle Sam, individual things go into Uncle Sam's hand. Individual income tax, corporate income tax. It's quite surprising, or it was surprising to me that individual income tax is so much larger in collection than corporate income tax. Social security tax, the excise tax, gift tax, customs duty, miscellaneous stuff that he gets. And then he has to give it out. This area is his mandatory spending, and this area here is his discretionary spending. So he has to spend this because he's promised it, right? And then he can make some difference in how he spends this, right? So if you look at the mandatory spending, Medicare, funds to low-income earners, Social Security, VA benefits, health, and of course interest on the national debt. Look how big interest is on the national debt. It's bigger than the spendings on health, for example, almost the same as the welfare spending. And then if you look at the discretionary spending, look how big the defense budget is. It's so much bigger than the education budget, for example. Yeah. So you can see after he pays this out, he has a little bit left over, which is great, But if you look at that amount, that is just a drop in the sea of what is the national debt, see? And then he discusses a little bit on the top here, who owns the debt, why it's dangerous or why it's okay, and so on and so forth. So I just think that is such a masterpiece of storytelling in terms of the graphics and the information design. Nigel Holmes used to be the design director of the Times, and he did many information graphics for them over the years. Okay. So, thank you. I think I'm a little early, but maybe you enjoy having the break. After lunch is always the sleepiest time, I think. Do you have any questions or comments? Okay, yes? So the question is, what programs are we using to design information graphics? Usually, the students use Excel to make the actual information graphics, and then we move them from there, copying and pasting, into a vector program called Adobe Illustrator. Yeah, so that's mostly, we pretty much do things by hand. It wouldn't be necessarily the way you would want to go if you weren't a designer, because Adobe Illustrator is quite expensive, for example. So I believe there's these other programs now that have become a little more popular, Tableau, for example, or the new version of Excel. But to make those elaborate layouts, you really need a kind of real design software. Yeah. Yes?
Now, I'm thinking of your Mercer Island example.
Mm-hmm.
You said the people that designed that infographic, they wanted to increase the amount.
They did want to increase the amount.
It looked like it's only a small sliver that's growing, and it kind of proves their point. But then you said, well, actually, it doesn't have a big impact on the environment. My question is, when accuracy is your goal, do you worry about some of these things where the graphic is proving the point that you already wanted to make?
It is, I think, a tricky ethical thing. You know, I mean, I have mixed feelings about it myself. It wasn't until actually after I made this graphic for them and I did some research that I read that, you know, even as little as 3 or 5% of impervious surface could make a huge difference in the temperature of the water, and that's something that affects the wildlife. You know, at the time that I made it, the people who I worked for, you know, they didn't tell me that. They just said, we need to make this more understandable, you know. At the same time, I also feel like it's not like they were trying to build a shopping mall. They wanted to build a school, you know. I think schools there have some kind of overcrowding and so forth, you know, so it's not necessarily, you know, the issue. I think it's very complicated. One of the things you can do to improve it is to have things like green roofs, for example, because, you know, then you replace impervious surface with pervious surface. That costs more. So the client has to also want to do those kinds of things, you know, in order to alleviate the problem. Yeah, it's not a really clear answer. I feel kind of bad about it now, to be honest, but I still think it's interesting, you know, in terms of like clarifying the information.
Well, in general, though, do you find that it helps to like vet them by other people, or just, you know, so that your own going into it, the answer you want isn't the answer that you end up getting because you're designing the visualization?
It probably would be a good thing. I mean, I don't always think that as a designer. The question was, do you think you should vet it? You know, how much responsibility do you have ethically, I think, as a designer, you know, looking at the information graphics that you create? You know, I guess I kind of, in this case, I sort of trusted that they were doing the right thing, and by helping them, I would be doing the right thing. I think I would probably be more cautious, actually, in some ways now. Of course, I have that luxury. I'm a professor at the University of Washington. If I don't get any consulting work, I can still, you know, manage on my regular life, you know? I mean, I feel good that I'm not making advertisements for cigarettes, I suppose, you know? But I mean, it is a gray area. For example, one of my colleagues, you know, she's a guest faculty member we have, and she does the work for Coca-Cola. And I thought that was pretty much okay. But then several of the students told me, like, you know, Coke is like cigarettes now, you know, that because of the obesity crisis, you know? And I said, well, it's not like you should drink Coke so much, you know, like just have a little Coke. And then the students said, but that's not how they feel. If you read their materials, they're like, you know, Coke every day, every moment, you know? And I was like, okay, maybe that is wrong. Should I tell that faculty member you shouldn't do Coke? But, you know, she actually does the environmental, oh, well, I know. Oh, well. But, you know, she actually does the environmental responsibility brochures for Coca-Cola. You know what I mean? Like where they talk about how they're not hurting the land, they make Coke somehow through ethical means or so forth. You know, it's difficult, actually, to remain completely clean, you know, in the world, maybe. Yeah. A larger, broader social issue. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. I think that would be great. The question is, what kind of background should students have in order to kind of get into this field? I think there's a guy actually who's speaking next, is from Microsoft, and he's going to talk about a career in data science, and I was actually going to go to that. Most of the students we train in our undergrad program are generalists, so, you know, some of them will go and work in package design, some of them will work in branding, some of them, you know, something. Some of them have gone into information science, and I think it has been useful the way, you know, combining attributes of design with the statistical information. I do think it would be great if they would take programming. We have a class in something called processing, which is kind of a form of JavaScript that was designed for designers. And we have a class, you know, there's a class that they could take in statistics. There are classes they can take in R, you know, which is a statistical program. But not all the undergraduate students would be capable or interested in taking that unless they wanted to specialize in this field. I think it's something that happens more at the graduate level now or through certificate programs. Yeah. So there's actually a really some interesting information design programs in Europe. There's one in Sweden, and there's one in the UK in the Reading University. Yeah. Any other comments or questions? Yes?
Are any of your students looking for internships?
Yeah, actually they are all the time. And often those internships do involve information design. In fact, the reason Chris Sorensen asked me to come here is because he's hired some of our students to do some work on, I think, a kind of reporting development tool that he's working on, I think, on the side. Yeah, so students are extremely eager to make some money in the summer. Generally, they make between $10 and $15 an hour at the undergraduate level, maybe 25 to 35 at the graduate level. Yeah. If you're interested, you could email me, and I'm happy to share your internship opportunity with our students. Yeah. Okay, in the back? Oh, no, it's just somebody getting up. Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.